In 1095, a single speech changed the course of history forever. Pope Urban II stood before a crowd in France and unleashed a holy war that would span centuries. What happened next was the First Crusade, a brutal, chaotic, and transformative campaign that reshaped the medieval world. But this wasn't the noble quest that many imagine. This is the real story of religious fervor, political ambition, and unprecedented violence. Welcome back to History of War. And today we're diving into one of the most consequential military campaigns in human history. The First Crusade lasted from 1096 to 1099, but its effects rippled through time for nearly 1,000 years. By the end of this video, you'll understand how a papal speech launched 100,000 people on a journey to the Holy Land, and why most of them never returned. To understand the First Crusade, we need to step into the medieval world of 1095. Europe was a fractured continent of warring kingdoms, where knights spent most of their time fighting each other. The Catholic Church was desperately trying to control this violence through something called the Peace of God movement. Meanwhile, in the East, the Byzantine Empire was in crisis. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos faced a terrifying enemy. The Seljuk Turks had conquered most of Anatolia, the empire's heartland. These Muslim warriors had even defeated a massive Byzantine army at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, capturing the previous emperor himself. But here's what's crucial to understand: this wasn't really about religion yet. Alexios needed mercenaries, not holy warriors. When he sent envoys to Pope Urban II asking for help, he was thinking about a few thousand professional soldiers, not the massive religious movement that was about to explode across Europe. The Islamic world was also divided. The Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt hated the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, who in turn competed with the Seljuk Turks. Jerusalem itself had changed hands between Muslim powers multiple times in recent decades. This division would prove crucial to Crusader success. On November 27, 1095, Pope Urban II delivered a speech at the Council of Clermont that would echo through history. Unfortunately, we don't have his exact words. Medieval chroniclers each recorded different versions. But the message was explosive. Urban declared that Christ's tomb was in the hands of unclean nations and called for a holy war to reclaim it. He promised something revolutionary: complete forgiveness of sins for anyone who took up the cross. In medieval thinking, this was essentially a guaranteed ticket to heaven. But Urban was also solving a political problem. European knights were constantly fighting each other, devastating the countryside. The crusade would redirect this violence outward while strengthening papal authority. It was brilliant political maneuvering disguised as religious devotion. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Nobles began planning expeditions, while common people sold everything they owned to join the cause. The Pope's call had unleashed forces far beyond what anyone anticipated. Before the official crusade even began, a charismatic preacher named Peter the Hermit sparked something unexpected: the People's Crusade. Tens of thousands of peasants, led by Peter and a knight called Walter the Penniless, set off for Jerusalem months ahead of schedule. This was a humanitarian disaster waiting to happen. These weren't trained soldiers, they were farmers, craftsmen, and desperate people with almost no military experience. They had little food, no proper weapons, and no realistic plan. The People's Crusade quickly devolved into violence against European Jewish communities. In cities like Mainz, Speyer, and Worms, Crusaders massacred thousands of Jews, reasoning that they should kill Christ's enemies at home before traveling to fight them abroad. This anti-Semitic violence became a horrific pattern throughout the Crusades. When these untrained masses finally reached Byzantine territory, Emperor Alexios was horrified. This wasn't the professional army he'd requested. He quickly shipped them across to Anatolia, where the Seljuk Turks annihilated them near Nicaea in October 1096. Peter the Hermit survived, but most of his followers perished in what became known as the Peasants' Crusade. The real crusade began in 1096 with several armies led by powerful nobles. Unlike the People's Crusade, these were professional military expeditions with experienced commanders. The key leaders included Godfrey of Bouillon from Lorraine, Bohemond of Taranto from southern Italy, Raymond of Toulouse from southern France, and Baldwin of Boulogne, Godfrey's ambitious brother. Each commanded thousands of knights and infantry, making this one of the largest military movements Europe had ever seen. But here's what's fascinating: these weren't unified armies under a single command. Each leader had his own ambitions, and they often worked at cross purposes. Bohemond wanted to carve out territory in the east. Baldwin was openly seeking land and power. Raymond claimed to be the most pious, but he was just as politically motivated as the others. The journey to Constantinople was treacherous. Armies had to cross hostile territory, manage massive logistical challenges, and deal with local populations who weren't always friendly to armed pilgrims passing through their lands. The first major test came at Nicaea, the Seljuk capital in Anatolia. This was a formidable fortress city that controlled the approaches to Jerusalem. The siege began in May 1097 and immediately revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of the Crusader army. The Crusaders had superior heavy cavalry and siege equipment, but they struggled with unity of command. Different armies attacked different sections of the walls, often without coordination. The siege dragged on for weeks as the Turks launched fierce counterattacks. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: Byzantine naval power. Emperor Alexios transported ships overland to Lake Ascania, cutting off the city's water supply. Faced with inevitable defeat, the Turkish garrison secretly negotiated surrender with the Byzantines, not the Crusaders. This created immediate tension. The Crusaders had done the fighting, but the Byzantines claimed the prize. Many Crusaders felt betrayed, setting up conflicts that would plague the entire campaign. However, the victory proved that the supposedly invincible Seljuk Turks could be defeated. After Nicaea, the Crusader army faced a grueling march across Anatolia during the summer of 1097. This wasn't just a military campaign, it was a humanitarian crisis in motion. Historians estimate that disease, starvation, and Turkish attacks killed more Crusaders during this march than in all the major battles combined. The heat was unbearable, water sources were scarce, and Turkish horsemen harassed the columns constantly. Knights had to abandon their heavy armor, horses died by the thousands, and many nobles ended up walking alongside common soldiers. But the Crusaders learned to adapt. They developed better marching formations, improved their scouting, and began coordinating more effectively between the different armies. By the time they reached Anch in October 1097, they had become a more professional military force. Anch presented a new challenge entirely. This was one of the greatest fortress cities in the world, with massive walls that stretched for miles. Unlike Nicaea, this siege would test everything the Crusaders had learned about medieval warfare. The siege of Anch became an 8-month nightmare that nearly destroyed the crusade. The city's walls were impregnable, and the garrison was well supplied and determined to resist. Worse, a massive Turkish relief army under Kerboga of Mosul was marching to break the siege. By early 1098, the Crusaders were trapped between the city walls and the approaching Turkish army. Supplies ran out, men were eating grass and leather, and desertion became epidemic. Even some leaders abandoned the cause. Stephen of Blois fled back to Europe, telling everyone the crusade was doomed. The breakthrough came through treachery, not military might. A tower guard named Firouz, possibly motivated by bribes or personal grievances, agreed to let Bohemond's men into the city. On June 3, 1098, Crusaders scaled the walls and opened the gates. The massacre that followed was horrific even by medieval standards. But victory turned to crisis within days. Kerboga's relief army arrived and besieged the Crusaders inside the city they had just captured. Now they faced starvation again, this time trapped inside Anch's walls with a hostile army outside. After Anch, the crusade nearly fell apart due to political infighting. Bohemond claimed Anch as his personal territory, violating agreements with the Byzantine Emperor. Baldwin had already broken away to establish his own county in Edessa. The unity of purpose that had carried the Crusaders this far was fracturing. It took until January 1099 for the remaining leaders to continue toward Jerusalem. By now, the army was much smaller but more experienced. They had learned to fight in desert conditions, to besiege fortified cities, and to exploit divisions among their Muslim opponents. The march south revealed the complex religious landscape of the region. Many local Christian communities, Armenians, Syrian Orthodox, and others, initially welcomed the Crusaders as liberators from Muslim rule. But tensions quickly emerged over theological differences and competing claims to authority. When the Crusaders finally saw Jerusalem on June 7, 1099, many wept with joy. They had traveled over 2,000 miles, survived battles, disease, starvation, and countless hardships to reach Christianity's holiest city. But the final test still lay ahead. Jerusalem was defended by a Fatimid garrison under Iftikhar ad-Dawla, who had recently recaptured it from the Seljuk Turks. The city's walls were formidable, and the defenders were well prepared for a siege. The Crusaders initially lacked proper siege equipment, and their first assault on June 13 failed completely. But Geno's ships arrived at nearby Jaffa carrying skilled engineers and siege materials. Working frantically, the Crusaders built massive siege towers and battering rams. The final assault began on July 14, 1099. Godfrey of Bouillon's tower breached the northern wall while Raymond of Toulouse attacked from the south. Once the walls were breached, resistance collapsed quickly. What followed was one of medieval history's most notorious massacres. For 3 days, Crusaders slaughtered Muslims, Jews, and even some Eastern Christians throughout the city. Contemporary accounts, even by Crusader chroniclers, describe streets running with blood and piles of severed hands and heads. This massacre became a defining moment that poisoned Christian-Muslim relations for centuries. While medieval warfare was often brutal, the scale and religious motivation of the Jerusalem massacre created lasting trauma in Islamic memory. The First Crusade was just the beginning of a much larger story. Over the next 200 years, there would be 8 more major crusades, each with its own drama, heroes, and tragedies. The Crusader kingdoms would face constant pressure from Muslim counterattacks, leading to legendary figures like Saladin and Richard the Lionheart. What aspects of the Crusades would you like to see covered next? The military innovations? The legendary siege of Acre? The rise of the military orders like the Knights Templar? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into medieval warfare, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. In the next video, we're covering the Siege of Constantinople 1453. Until then, remember that history is written by those who dare to seek the truth, no matter how complex or uncomfortable it might be.